A crew member working on the TV show Cops was shot while filming an episode by the cops themselves. So what exactly went down here? Well, let's find out. Today we have the story of a man named Bryce Dion, who was 38 years old at the time, and this story took place a few years ago back in 2014. Bryce was a sound mixer, a really good one. He'd been doing it for years at this point, and back in 2009 he had gotten a really solid gig working on the TV show Cops. After working on the show for about 7 years, Bryce moved on up and got promoted to the position of sound supervisor. So for those of you who have all lived under one big collective rock together, or people outside of the US I suppose, Cops was a TV show about cops. It was a reality show. It basically followed police officers around as they performed their coply duties. Everyone knows the theme song, at least, of which I am legally only allowed to play a few seconds of.
Bad boys, what you gonna do?
Honestly, the show is pretty entertaining, and not gonna lie, I watched it quite a few times. Everybody did. We got a lot of really classic moments out of this show, like the one that became the old YTM&D fad, the you can't break these cuffs guy. That's one of my favorites.
Get down. Get down off.
I can break these cuffs.
You can't break those cuffs.
Ready to get back to work on the show, Bryce had flown out to Omaha, Nebraska, helping to film and produce the sound for the new season of Cops that was mainly going to focus on that area. The production company said that he was a long-term member of the Cops team and a very talented and dedicated person. Cops had always been a dangerous show to work on. Hell, the constant threat of danger was a major appeal of the show. People wanted to see the kind of stuff that cops really had to deal with, and granted, of course they were only going to cherry-pick the arrests that were actually interesting to watch, but that's what the people wanted to see anyway. As a precaution, the production company made employees go through training and even gave them bulletproof vests to wear while filming. But even so, the International Alliance of Theatrical Stage Employees, which is somewhat of a union that represents crew members on film and TV sets, were pretty concerned about the safety of working on reality shows in general. So you can only imagine how they felt about this one. Not only that, but reality shows weren't really covered on a lot of union contracts. But somehow, as dangerous as it may have been and as crazy as the premise was, nobody actually died while working on the show. For the first several years, that is. Bryce had been in Omaha for several weeks, working on the Cops crew, filming bits here and there and making sure the sound was all nice and chunky. Bryce, while still professional and cooperative, preferred to remain a ghost while filming. He told the officers to pretend the filming crew wasn't even there. Things were going great. But then, one fateful night, it all hit the fan. It was 9:20 p.m., August 26th of 2014 in Omaha, Nebraska. There was a call to the police about a robbery taking place at a Wendy's store at the intersection of Dodge Street and North 43rd Street. A detective on scene requested backup, and that's where Bryce Dion's crew came in. Within 15 seconds, they were there on scene, ready to deal with the Hamburglar. 3 officers rushed into the restaurant, ready to apprehend the suspect. Officers Cunningham and Riley rushed in through the east door, and Officer Wilhelm went in through the west entrance. Bryce, along with the cameraman Lee, followed Officer Cunningham in through the east. The suspect was standing there in plain sight, holding up a handgun. The man was 32-year-old Cortez Washington, who was in the middle of trying to rob the place. Cortez turned around and pointed his gun at the police. They were stunned, and they had to act quick. He immediately started firing at them. 3 individuals inside of Wendy's witnessed Mr. Washington holding a handgun and discharged the handgun directly at Detective Cunningham and Officer Riley. The Omaha Police Chief Todd Schmaderer said. The witnesses described hearing the suspect's handgun being fired and seeing the slide recoil with the shots. The first 2 audible shots were from Mr. Washington. Cortez fired 2 shots at the officers, who responded with a barrage of gunfire, to say the least. Cortez tried to bail out of the Wendy's despite being riddled with bullets by this point and made it as far as the parking lot when the officers shot him. He died there on the scene. However, Cortez wasn't the only victim of this gunfight. Bryce, while operating the microphone, had positioned himself against the eastern doorway of the restaurant, one of those entrances that kind of juts out and mainly consists of windows. Cortez ran right past him while trying to flee. This was when one of the bullets from the police hit him in the armpit, going into his chest. He just happened to get hit only once, right where the vest didn't cover him. So how did they immediately know that the bullet wasn't from the police? Well, here's the thing. Cortez didn't even have a real gun. He had a very realistic-looking airsoft pistol, which was said to look and sound like a real gun, at least. Whether or not it really sounded like one, I can't say for sure. I mean, you wouldn't think so, but that is what they said. Either way, you get the idea. It wasn't firing any real bullets. Bryce collapsed right there in the doorway. He was rushed to the University of Nebraska Medical Center, where he sadly passed away shortly after. Police examined Cortez's weapon and were horrified to see that it wasn't even a real gun this whole time. At the time, they had no way of knowing. All they knew was that someone was shooting at them. The media was soon all over this case, and eventually the police had to speak out. One of those to speak first was the police chief himself, Todd Schmaderer. He said that Bryce was a dear friend to the officers, someone that they'd really gotten along with. "This is as if we lost one of our own," he said. "This is the grieving process we're going through right now." Naturally, an investigation took place. Lee's own footage, meant to be for the show, ended up becoming a major piece of evidence. The most major piece of evidence, perhaps. The police chief commented on it after reviewing it, saying, "Based on our viewing of the footage, the officers had no choice other than to respond the way that they did." He had been under a lot of scrutiny since information got out about the incident. People were mainly interested in why so many bullets had been fired. People started to question whether the cops were showing off for the cameras, trying to look more badass for the show. The chief said that those assertions were absolutely ridiculous. This was a very harrowing situation, he said. The production company, Langley Productions, was pretty quick to speak out as well, saying that they were deeply saddened and shocked by this tragedy and that their main concern was helping out his family in any way that they could. They flew out to Omaha shortly after, but they weren't really sure what to do about the situation. Up until that point, the only crew injury on the show was related to a minor car accident back in 2009, but even that crew member was able to return to work shortly after. This was major. They went from basically nothing to an actual death. Mr. Dion paid the ultimate price for his service, to provide the footage of the real-life dangers that law enforcement officers face on a daily basis to television viewers around the world, said the police chief. The crew wrapped up production for the time being. People were curious as to whether or not cops would continue filming in that area. The police chief responded, "We haven't gotten that far." It was pretty likely that that was the last thing on their mind as the investigation continued. Bryce's family, needless to say, was not happy about any of this. After a while, they went on to file a wrongful death suit against the city of Omaha. They had a lot to say. For instance, 1. Omaha police should have provided Bryce with a special duty of care and protection, and that shooting him was pure negligence. And 2. The police failed to identify their target before firing their weapons. They used excessive force, and they acted unreasonably around innocent bystanders. The city of Omaha argued back, saying that the use of force was objectively reasonable and that Bryce knew the risks when taking the job. They added that he voluntarily, without any urging from anyone, put himself in between the police and the robber during the act of robbery. The lower court wasn't really having it. The family continued to argue their case, saying that it wasn't appropriate of the officers to fire 36 shots during the robbery. Officers responded by saying that they didn't see Bryce in their line of fire. If they did, they would have absolutely lowered their weapons. One officer said that they did avoid aiming at employees who they could see. Failing to see Bryce was simply a mistake. A horrible mistake, but a mistake. The officers continued to discharge their firearms at Washington after he lowered his firearm, exited the restaurant, and ran through the parking lot because they believed that he continued to pose a threat to their lives and the lives of others as he was fleeing, said the court. The court dismissed the case, much to the dismay of the Dion family. However, this calculation does not make Bryce Dion's death any less tragic, said the judge, speaking of his conclusion. In addition to being a loving son and brother, Bryce Dion was undoubtedly courageous and a credit to his profession. The Dion's lawyers were ready to start discussing an appeal, and eventually it was decided that they'd give it a shot, at least. The appeal went all the way up to the Nebraska Supreme Court. However, it didn't really progress much farther than that at all. The Supreme Court pretty much just agreed with the lower court's decision on the case, and a couple of months ago, back in May of 2022, they just fully dismissed it. It seems that this case is really good and done, and that's probably all that's ever going to come of it. Once again, thank you for watching this video. I can see that this one is probably going to be a divisive one. Yeah, usually any of them that involve cops kind of are. If you found it interesting, if you've never heard about the case before, please give it a like. It helps with the algorithm. And if you like weird crimes like this, feel free to subscribe, as I do talk about them quite a bit. And hey, if you don't like me later, you can just unsub whenever you want. If you don't mind, add me on social media, because you know how YouTube is. If anything were to ever happen to the channel, that would probably be the only way you'd ever hear about it. And if you want to support the channel even further, I do have a Patreon account, which I always keep linked down in the description below. And speaking of which, shout out to the top patrons. We have Entreprenant, Greg, El Palmieri, Salad, Kevin, AMCMT, Rick of Work in Progress USA, Tang, Sash Johnson, Marianne McCurdy, Buttery Frankus, Wolfrans, Jules Latona, Arctic Cat, Alan Damianri, Adrian Lawley, Marsh, Buffazerg, Rinsenstein, Kim Peak, Lux Alpaca, Charity, Scoochie Main, Jackie, and Mark Barnett. You guys tickle my fancy. Hee hee. This has been your host, Kyle. Thank you, and good night.